PhilosophyTube published a video entitled African Philosophy and the Enlightenment. It's only about 11 minutes long, and you really should watch it before you finish watching this response. Please note that this video is not a takedown or rebuttal or even challenge to Ollie's original video. It's a critical response aimed at presenting an alternative, though not completely different, perspective. I'm going to point out some facts which I think contradict some of his conclusions, some facts which I think weaken some of his arguments, and some facts which I think not only support some of his arguments, but actually make them even stronger. There's a lot to cover, so I'll be releasing this response in 4 parts once a week.
All men are equal in the presence of God, and all are intelligent, since they are his creatures. He did not assign one people for life, another for death, one for mercy, another for judgment. Our reason teaches us that this sort of discrimination cannot exist in the sight of God, who is perfect in all his works.
This sounds very straightforward. It looks like Yacob is calling all men equal and protesting against people discriminating against others. However, if we read on, we find this isn't speaking of people having equal rights, and it isn't talking about people being discriminatory. This is a theological statement, not an ethical statement. Yacob is saying that in God's view, all people are equal, and that God has not favored one group of people over another. Yacob is saying that God does not discriminate between people when he reveals himself. This is made very clear when we keep reading. Jacob's words demonstrate that he is addressing the fact that different religions each claim to be a unique revelation from God, which was given only to certain people. Citing the Christians as an example, he says, quote, "At this very time, Christians say God's doctrine is only found with us," end quote. He then says, quote, "Similarly with the Jews, the Mohammedans, the Indians, and the others," end quote. So this passage doesn't actually say what it seems. In this place, Yacob wasn't calling all people equal and protesting against people discriminating against others. Having said that, let's be clear on the fact that even though this passage doesn't show Yacob saying all people are equal, we've already seen that he does say this very clearly elsewhere in his condemnation of slavery, explaining that God, quote, "made us equal like brothers," end quote. What's important here is reading Yacob in context and realizing that when he uses certain words and even phrases, he isn't always using them in the same context with the same meaning.
Right off the bat, if you've read any of the European Enlightenment philosophers, you can see that Yacob beat a lot of them to the punch.
As my previous videos in this series have shown, Yacob didn't actually beat a lot of the European Enlightenment philosophers to the punch. In fact, all of his genuinely revolutionary ideas had already been proposed and developed by European thinkers, sometimes centuries before he lived. What is remarkable about Yacob, however, as I've pointed out previously, is the fact that he reached his own conclusions independently of these European precursors, and that's a far more intriguing fact. Since we're looking at Jacob's view of the equality of all people, let's identify the earlier European thinkers who held to this view even before the Enlightenment. We'll find that not only was this view already quite developed in Europe before Jacob's time, but a large number of those who held to it were active social reformers. Let's start with the Petition of Women in 1649, which was signed by an astonishing 10,000 women and presented to the English Parliament. This petition insisted that women had equal right to the same political privileges as men on the basis of, quote, "our creation in the image of God and of an interest in Christ equal to men," end quote. The sheer number of signatories to this petition demonstrates just how well developed this concept of equal rights and political consciousness had become among women in 17th century England. The women based their claim to political privilege directly on the Bible, citing the book of Genesis chapter 1 verse 27, which says that both men and women were created in the image of God. This verse was commonly used by proto-feminists of the pre-modern era to insist that God had created men and women as equal. The petition also says that women are, quote, "of an interest in Christ equal to men," end quote, a reference to the New Testament teaching that in the Christian community, quote, "there is no male nor female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus," end quote, taken from the book of Galatians chapter 3 verse 28. The women who presented this position belonged to the Levellers, a group of English social reformers who agitated for a range of civil liberties, including freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of the press. They were also radically egalitarian in their attitude to women. The Levelers were the pre-modern ancestors of the later libertarians and classical liberals. Moving back to the 16th century, we find Jean Bodin, whose book The Six Books of a Commonweal, 1576, argued that no man should, quote, make a slave of his wife, end quote, and that slavery should be abolished on the principle of divine law and natural rights, saying, quote, servitude is directly contrary to nature, end quote. Still earlier in the 16th century, the Memmingen Articles of 1525 were a petition demanding the abolition of serfdom, a kind of involuntary bonded servitude similar to slavery, appealing to the equality of all human beings on the basis that they were created in the image of God. This petition was part of the Peasants' War in Germany, 1524 to 1525, a widespread uprising involving hundreds of thousands of people agitating for social reform. Key leaders and supporters of the movement were Christian groups such as the Anabaptists and Radical Reformers, which made theological arguments for social justice and societal change on the basis of Christian teachings. Around 150 years earlier still, Christian priest John Ball, cited in the third video of this series, helped lead the English Peasants' Revolt in 1381. He preached a sermon against servitude, saying, quote, from the beginning all men by nature were created alike, end quote, and describing bondage and servitude as the oppression of evil men. Ball's social justice campaign involved travelling the country and preaching, calling for egalitarian social reformation. So Yacob's view of the equality of all people on the basis of the creation of humans by God was not revolutionary. This core Bible teaching had already been used as the foundation of repeated social reform movements throughout Europe for centuries before Yacob was born. In contrast, Yacob himself did not call for or participate in movements for social justice. Still, Yacob's view was disruptive in 17th century Ethiopia, and he did reach this position independently of his European counterparts.
It's also very interesting that Yacob explicitly argues against slavery. The quote, all men are created equal, is normally attributed either to the United States Declaration of Independence or to the philosopher John Locke, whose work greatly inspired it.
As we've seen, the view that all men are created equal predates John Locke and the United States Declaration of Independence and Zera Yacob. In Europe, it was a common theological argument against slavery and servitude for centuries, all the way back to at least the 5th century.
But here's Yacob, ahead of the pack, running out and saying, actually no, slavery is bad and racial hierarchy is nonsense.
Yacob condemned slavery, but he was not ahead of the pack in that regard. Unfortunately, he was not an active abolitionist, and in that regard, he was well behind the pack. Additionally, he said nothing about racial hierarchy, and it is not even clear if he thought in racial terms. Yacob would have had no fear of racism. He was a member of the Tigrayan ethnic group, one of the two dominant groups in Ethiopia, so although his family was poor, Yacob was nevertheless born into social privilege. The Amhara and Tigrayan people historically battled each other for control of Ethiopia, and still do, but both groups were sufficiently powerful that they were able to dominate and enslave Ethiopia's other ethnic groups, despite being numerically smaller than them. So Yacob was a member of the dominant social elite and enjoyed not only the safety and comfort of that position, but privileges such as multilingual literacy, an extensive education, and financial independence. He didn't even have to work for a living. Even when he fled from his enemies to live in a cave, he says he took with him, quote, 3 measures of gold, end quote, which was obviously a considerable sum. During his time in the cave, he said he occasionally ventured out to the nearby market, from which he obviously bought food, or to the nearby region of the Amhara people, where he was given food by those who mistook him for a begging hermit. After his 2 years in the cave, he found a wealthy merchant who became his patron for life. Yacob experienced some hardship in his life, but it was never the hardship of the marginalized or underprivileged. Consequently, it is unsurprising that there is no evidence that Yacob ever experienced racism. He speaks frequently of religious persecution and of his political enemies, but says nothing about racism and never even attributes racism to the Portuguese. There is a long history of racism and ethnic prejudice in Ethiopia, but it has traditionally been practiced by Ethiopian ethnic groups against other African ethnic groups. In fact, Yacob's own ethnic group practiced racism, prejudice, and slavery against others. The Oromo people are the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, comprising around 34% of the population, yet they have been persecuted, enslaved, and marginalized by the dominant Ethiopian ethnic groups, in particular the Amhara and Tigrayan people, for hundreds of years. Those dominant ethnic groups differentiated the Oromo people from other African ethnic groups by their color and created disparaging, dehumanizing terms for them, characterizing them as primitive, barbaric, and savage. In the modern era, from the 18th century onwards, the Amhara and Tigrayan people suppressed Oromo nationalism and conducted a campaign of institutionalized racism and prejudice to justify the colonization and marginalization of the Oromo people and their territory. So Yacob was a member of a dominant ethnic group which practiced institutional racism and which enslaved and persecuted other groups, especially the Oromo people. Given the ubiquitous nature of the Ethiopian slave trade, and given how pervasive institutional racism was in Ethiopia, it is extremely doubtful that Yacob was unaware of all this. However, he does not mention any of this, which is unusual given his obvious concern for social equality and his clear objection to slavery. Consequently, it is unclear what Yacob would have actually thought about racial discrimination of any kind. In fact, Professor Chike Jeffers says, quote, "It is not clear that he thought about race at all," end quote.
That whole bit about miracles and how every religion has miracle stories that supposedly prove it's true, but they can't all be true, so we need to critically examine miracle stories, that prefigures David Hume's essay on miracles, which is still the go-to text on the philosophy of miracles in British philosophy education, certainly, but which Hume wouldn't write for another 100 years.
I'm going to work through this point in steps because it's easy to overread what Yacob is saying here and interpret him as taking a position which is actually well beyond what he wrote and meant. Let's start with what Yacob actually wrote. Ollie is right to say that Yacob addressed the question of religious appeals to miracles in order to validate specific religions. Yacob says, quote, "They say that the law of Christianity is from God and miracles are brought forth to prove it," end quote. So Christians appeal to miracles in order to substantiate their claim that Christianity is true. Yacob then says that, quote, "But our intelligence tells us and confirms to us with proofs that marriage springs from the law of the Creator," end quote. Here he is saying that a combination of our observation of nature and our own reason confirms that marriage is natural, since it was ordained by God. Yacob then uses this apparently established fact to falsify the Christian doctrine that monks should be celibate. He says, quote, "Yet monastic law renders this wisdom of the Creator ineffectual, since it prevents the generation of children and extinguishes mankind," end quote. Summarized, this is what Yacob is saying. 1. Christians appeal to miracles to prove their religion is true. 2. We can examine their religious teachings using our observation of nature and our reason. 3. When we do so, we find certain Christian teachings contradict what appears to be the natural law of God. 4. Therefore, we must conclude that the Christian teachings which are claimed to be divine truths cannot have come from God and are false, since they contradict what God has revealed in nature. What's missing from this is an actual critical examination of miracles. In no part of Yacob's argument does he actually say we need to critically examine miracle stories. On the contrary, he completely overlooks the topic of whether or not the miracles actually happened, and instead focuses on whether the religion's teachings agree with what he understands God to have revealed through nature and reason. This is unsurprising when we realize that Yacob never shows any skepticism of miracles at all. Not only does he never say we should critically examine miracle stories, Yacob never proposes a systematic critical analysis of miracles. On the contrary, his own words tell us that he uncritically accepted miracles which he believed happened in his own life. In the first chapter of his treatise, Yacob describes how once when he was a child, he was saved from death, quote, "by a miracle from God," end quote. In chapter 17 of his treatise, Yacob describes how he prayed to God to punish one of his enemies, and he says his prayer was answered when the man was killed. In chapter 18 of his treatise, Yacob describes a famine which God inflicted on the land as a punishment for sin. Yacob describes these three events as miracles caused by the direct intervention of God. He never expresses any skepticism towards them at all, nor does he ever express any skepticism towards miracles. In his carefully detailed paper, Ethiopian Contention on the Issue of Rationality, Ethiopian scholar Belaina Girma describes Yacob's belief that he was saved by a miracle as, quote, not even to the slightest rational, end quote. Girma's fascinating article deserves a video all of its own, but here I will have to confine myself to a few salient points he makes on the matter of Yacob's apparent rationalism. Girma argues that Yacob's uncritical acceptance of miracles is not only in stark contradiction to the rationalism which Yacob claimed to hold, but also differentiates him from genuine rationalists and skeptics such as David Hume. His article examines in detail the conflict between Yacob's claim to be a rationalist skeptic and his repeated profession of beliefs on a basis which is not rational. After surveying and criticizing the evidence other scholars have presented for Yacob's apparent rationalism, Girma's conclusion is, quote, Zera Yacob is not a rationalist, end quote. Girma also provides intriguing insight into the way that English translations of Yacob's work, especially the translation of Professor Claude Summer, the translation I own, have led scholars astray by mistranslating words in Yacob's text, making them sound like 17th century European Enlightenment terminology. He notes in particular the number of times that the word reason appears in Summer's English translation of Yacob's treatise, noting that Summer used it to translate several different words, none of which actually mean reason. Girma says, quote, terms like heart, conscience, intelligence, and mind, think, are translated as reason, end quote, and adds, quote, these terms mean different things, end quote. The contrast between Yacob's unquestioning acceptance of these events as miracles and a skeptical view of the same events is made even more clear when we examine attitudes to miracles which were current in 16th century Europe, a full century before Yacob was writing. The Christian Reformation, which began in the early 1500s, prompted by various reform movements of the previous century, counterintuitively produced a skeptic movement, as early reformers and later Protestants applied reason to Roman Catholic religious beliefs and miracle claims. As the two sides found themselves competing for customers in the same theological market, they created intellectual tools to test, disprove, and dismantle each other's religious truth claims, and miracle stories were one of the first targets. Professor Alban Fortione notes, quote, the rationalist critique of miracles had in fact been adopted by numerous religious thinkers of the 16th century, end quote. Professor Colin Brown says, quote, skepticism received its strongest encouragement from religious apologists who sought to demolish all claims to knowledge of their opponents in order to make way for their own views, end quote. He cites several Protestants who used genuinely skeptical arguments against Catholic truth claims. This rush to critical examination of the religious and supernatural actually contributed significantly to skepticism in folk beliefs such as witches and witchcraft, helping put an end to the witch hunts. Even more remarkably, in the next century, Englishman Lord Herbert of Cherbury wrote a lengthy, systematic skeptical work which was a genuine precursor to David Hume's argument against miracles. Cherbury's work, published in 1645, is recognized by historians of philosophy to have completely anticipated Hume's arguments, though Hume's intellectual foundation differed from Cherbury's, and his conclusions went further.
The idea that God and the afterlife is essential to how we think about morality is normally attributed to Immanuel Kant, who wouldn't write it down until 1781.
Ollie doesn't provide any quotations from Yacob or develop this point any further, so I'm not sure about the argument he's making here. However, I did find an article on Medium called Zera Yacob by Kush Vanakiso, which Ollie used as a source for his own research on Yacob. This article says, quote, the idea that God and the afterlife are essential to informing our understanding of morality is often attributed to Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason, which Yacob also predates by over a century, end quote, but it does not explain this in any detail. Consequently, it's unclear what this comment about Kant is actually supposed to be saying. Having looked through Yacob's treatise, I couldn't find any obvious parallels between what he says on the afterlife and any arguments by Kant, and I couldn't find anything in Yacob's comments on morality and the afterlife which hadn't already been made by earlier religious writers.
How come Yacob isn't credited for having so many of these ideas before anybody else?
Well, mainly because he simply didn't have these ideas before anybody else. Although his views on the equality of wives and husbands, on the equality of all humans, on deriving ethics by reasoning from natural law, on testing religious truth claims, and on slavery were all revolutionary in 17th century Ethiopia, these ideas had already been voiced many centuries before in Europe, where they had been developed to a far greater degree. Additionally, unlike the many European social reformers before him, Yacob was not an active reformer himself. He wasn't even an active abolitionist of slavery, which he must have seen all around him, and for which his own ethnic group was largely responsible. Then there's the fact that despite his best attempt at rationalist skepticism, most of Yacob's revolutionary views were in fact based on Christian beliefs rather than rationalism. He didn't practice systematic skepticism, and he was fundamentally not a rationalist. By the time Yacob was writing, there was already a well-developed rationalist movement in Europe which practiced a far more skeptical attitude toward personal experiences, religious beliefs, and the existence of God. Nearly 100 years before Yacob, in 1547, the famous Italian philosopher Tullio d'Aragona wrote, quote, "I want you to bow to experience, which I trust by itself far more than all the reasons produced by the whole class of philosophers," end quote. Perhaps Yacob would have been pleased to know that some of his ideas had been preempted by a woman. As I have mentioned previously, Yacob's real value is not that he was the first to have these ideas, but that he came to many of his conclusions mainly by himself. There's a difference between being independent and being original. Yacob was largely independent, but only occasionally original. Yacob's writings could be characterized generally as both original and liberating. However, that which was genuinely liberating was not original, and that which was genuinely original was not often liberating. Yacob was sadly not very influential, mainly due to the fact that his ideas were so radical in his own time and place. Ironically, he would have been far more influential in Europe, where such ideas were already well established, and where people would have been far more receptive to his views. If he had lived in Europe, he would undoubtedly have contributed to the Enlightenment philosophical tradition. Although we know he had several students, only one of them, Walter Hewat, left us a written record of his own experiences with Yacob and his own reflections on Yacob's philosophy. However, brief though it is, Hewat's treatise is extremely valuable in demonstrating just how far Yacob's views had developed and the potential they had to go further. In fact, Hewat did go further, articulating an even more rigorous and systematic skepticism than his teacher. In Hewat's treatise, there is an effort to create a system of critical thought which goes well beyond Yacob's views. However, that's a topic for another time. So where does Yacob really stand in relation to the Enlightenment? I would say he stands in parallel to it. The European Enlightenment philosophers built their ideas on the basis of a lengthy tradition of European thought which was well over 1,000 years old. In many ways, they were more systematizers than innovators. Even their genuinely original ideas were typically just an extension of earlier European philosophical commentary which they inherited. Professor Chike Jeffers similarly describes Yacob as orthogonal to the Enlightenment. He says, quote, "There is a sense in which Locke and Descartes share a modernity that Zera Yacob does not, a point that need not lead us to deny that Zera Yacob is a modern philosopher, but rather to say that he inhabits a different modernity," end quote. Yacob should be read and appreciated for who he was in his time and place. His philosophical commentary has its own value, completely independently of its relationship to the European Enlightenment. He gains nothing from comparison with it, and loses nothing by his independence from it.